Yes. There we go. So, I was gonna say big thanks to Pat and Peggy, but they're not out here. But they, please, if you get a chance to say thank you to them, because setting up like this where we can meet in person is really great. I mean, they do an excellent job. Pat sets us all up and stuff. So, really, thanks for that hospitality there. Thank you guys all for coming out tonight. Tonight, after Andy speaks, we're going to have some club elections, and we are currently looking for a vice president of the club. So if anybody has a burning desire or calling during this that if they would be interested in that, we are looking for that. So then our other main topic is our auction that's coming up. So April 24th, 10 a.m. and that will be here. And if it's really cold, we'll do it in here, which could be anything here in Iowa, of course. You can still consign items. I don't recall what the last date. I think you can consign all the way up to it. I was going to ask Pat if he had any new stuff to the list. We've got a pretty big growing list. I think we've got.
He's getting some copies made for the list and bring them over.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, he can kind of maybe go over that at the end, but there's, I mean, a lot of different items. I think we got 3 or 4 pages worth of stuff. So that's good. We're really excited about that. We could use some volunteers if anybody could help. Some people move some things around. What did we call that? People organizing everybody's stuff.
Just when people bring things in on that morning, that we can get things set up and organized for you, so you have to be here over there. So.
Yep. Yeah, and we'll be having maid rights. We'll have drinks and stuff available. It'll be a good time. And also with the club elections, Rich Vonderow has offered to run for president, and I was going to let him do a little bit of introducing for yourself. Rich, could you just let people know who you are?
All right, Richard Vonderow. Been part of the club here for about 4 years now. Iowa Hunter Producers for 4 years. Only had bees now 3 years. So starting pretty good. We started with 2 hives and up to 3. Right now I have 17 hives this spring going right now. So it's been interesting. This last year was an interesting year for bees. I know everybody else had problems too. So I lost a few and stuff like that. So, but looking forward to a good year this year. So for everybody else does too. And if you got any questions or anything, just get a hold of one of us and if you need anything or be through the club or whatever. So
yeah, thank you. Yep, thank you. So yeah, that's great. And like I say, looking for a club vice president. So if anybody wants to nominate somebody or whatever you got to do. And so we're going to move on to our speaker. We've got Andy Joseph today, our state apiarist, and I'm going to let you do maybe a little bit of introduction.
All right.
Yeah, and then go to it. So let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, so I'm Andy Joseph. Let's see, I guess for 13 years, so over 13 years I've been with the state of Iowa, state apiarist here. I enjoy what I get to do. I've met most of you at these things before, but there are some new faces here tonight, which is great. So I run the inspection program, and in Iowa, technically any hive of bees in the state subject to inspection. In the reality of it, I would say over 99% of what we do is by request. So it's beekeepers that need a second pair of eyes in their hives. They've got a little something funky going on, and maybe a newer beekeeper, a little on the inexperienced side, and just wants that other person look over their shoulder, see what's going on in their hives, see if it's pest disease issues, see if it's just something that's correctable, that kind of thing. So we do a lot of those kind of hand-holding kind of inspections. And then we get in hives, in theory, anytime that something's being sold that contains comb or live bees, or moved across state lines, say for almond pollination, that kind of thing. So that keeps us busy in kind of spring and fall, right? So we're just coming through winter. Kind of the season of an inspector start off kind of depressing. We look at a lot of dead outs, right? People don't call me if everything is good. If everything looks great, you might talk to yourselves at a meeting, that kind of thing, but you're not going to probably call the state of Iowa and have them check it out. So when things are good, you kind of can tell this is good, right? When it's good, it's good. When it's bad, sometimes you want another person to have a look in there and see what's going on. So we do a lot of dead out hive inspections. And, you know, annually about the time that I start thinking, you know, this is kind of a waste of time, it's mites, I start to feel like a broken record, that's when we uncover something else that's, you know, maybe a more serious disease issue, and it reminds me of why we do these kind of inspections. And that bigger thing the last several years has been foul brood. We've had some foul brood popping up around the state, and so that's something to keep an eye on. As the weather breaks here, it's going to be a pretty quick shift of gears into nuke inspections, right? You know, we've got a lot of beekeepers replacing losses. We still somehow are getting new and you know, just cycles and cycles of new beekeepers coming into it every year. So that's good if you're a person that's selling bees. So whether it's packages or nuke sales, all that stuff has just been through the roof. And that'll keep us busy. And those are enjoyable, right? So we go from looking at just crappy dead stuff that's gross, disgusting, stinks, you know, often moldy, sticky, whatever, into all of a sudden the weather's nice and there's pollen and nectar coming in and the bees are looking good and we're looking at hives with good brood patterns. So I'm really looking forward to the next few weeks of inspection. We're running around like a crazy person looking at good bees, right? Everybody excited for spring. So packages are coming into the state. That's kind of a recent thing. We're starting to see those trickle in. That's always exciting too, right? And then as summer goes on, we're going to making honey. Inspections kind of roll down. We get ready for state fair with honey extraction, then we pick up in the end of the year with inspections for, again, a mix of people sending their bees out of state. There's always a surge of inspections for that, for those exit permits, and for people on the newer side of things maybe that want to just kind of know, where do I stand? How are these bees actually looking? How do I look for mites? Those kind of questions in preparation for winter. So spring is a good place to be in my mind. There is no lull. People always ask me what I do over winter in the job when I'm not looking at bees, and it's play catch up from everything that didn't get done during the busier season. And it's shorter every year, right? You know, we push those exit inspections just later and later every year. You know, sometimes into December. And then, you know, it's not long after that I'm starting to look at those dead bees, that kind of thing. So it's good, I enjoy it. So thanks for having me here tonight. And thanks to the Ennis's for hosting this. This is good and warm. This past year we've done a lot of Zoom meetings, which I don't personally really enjoy too much. And a couple groups have been meeting outdoors. And so I was telling Pat or somebody, you know, there's a South Iowa hive handlers group. And they've been meeting at their fairgrounds down there, their county fairgrounds, and that works really well, but on a day like today, it's a little chilly. Probably want a blanket or something like that. So this is wonderful, so thank you for that. All right. Let's start with that. I have a slideshow here. At first, just I spent the week last week, I took vacation time and ran out to California and picked up some packages along with a friend. Basically, I was his wife for the week. Normally his wife does go with him, so I was temporary Shannon is what they call me at Koehnen's. I guess I don't mind. we did not share a bed, we'll say that. It's cozy enough riding in a truck that long with another guy. But we had two flats, and so I just put this on there to laugh about it. This one when I was driving, and one on the way back when he was driving. I-80 is a mess, and when you're in a pretty heavy, tight suspension truck, it just gets you bouncing all the way there for 27, 28 hours of drive time. So we had some issues, but when we got there, it was all worth it. These are some of our bees here. Some friends, beekeepers in the area, including myself, of course, sent 2 semi-loads or close to that out there, and it was just great to see him. You know, we haven't seen him since around Thanksgiving last year. And so we got out there and dropped those package cages off at Koehnen, the return cages. So if you ever pay you for your package and you got your deposit, they end up back there and they refill them, obviously. So we dropped those off and then drove about 3 hours south to where the bees were. And so, you know, if you've ever just been in almost claustrophobic kind of grounds working bees, there's basically enough room in between these hives so that you can get through there easy, but there isn't any hive cart or anything like that you're going to pull through there. It's pretty tight. They are literally packed in there. And it was a great thing to see. And the weather was really good. And we just worked through them. So, you know, worked through 600 or so hives in the course of 2 days' time and made a bunch of splits and threw some treatments in there and all kinds of stuff like that, and it was great. We worked all day and then we worked all night moving bees in, and it was exactly the experience I was hoping for. This is when you got that many bees, and they're a little on the light side this year, and they're full of bees. And you crack open a hive in the middle of hundreds of hives in these holding yards, you get robbing whipped up into a frenzy. And so about the only strategy we had, and it did actually work to a certain degree, was to fill up those half drums with syrup in there and just let the bees have at those. And so that created target. And the sky was just, I mean, you can tell it just fills. It looks like a swarm, you know, coming in, if you've ever had that experience. Just absolutely full of them. But it did largely keep those bees off of us and off of our hives, which I was shocked about. I would have thought that open feeding in a yard that was that tight would have just set off a frenzy all throughout. So I thought that was neat, and I also thought it just makes just a crazy, crazy, chaotic photo there. That was real life, just loud in the air with bees. And this is what they look like. You know, a lot of them, it really varies out there. You know, generally I feel like you get more bees coming back into Iowa than probably what you'd had, or at least they're a little bit ahead of the game compared to wintering here. But man, anything that that survived out there, if you had one that was marked, you know, 2 frames, 3 frames, it's full bees this year. And that seemed universally true for the hives that we looked at. They are looking really, really good and really heavy. And that's a nice thing to be able to say in beekeeping in recent years, you know. Last year they were a lot heavier coming back, but the populations this year are just huge, absolutely huge. So good year for those package producers, right? They're going to shake a couple packages out of those. And then this is us at night, loaded up a couple semis in the evening. And you know, I've sent bees out to almonds at least since 2015, and I've always wanted to see the bloom out there. And of course that's long gone. But this was kind of a close second for me. It was really interesting just to see, just in the short couple months, like how much that stuff has matured out there. You know, to go from the bloom that the bees are on and the work that the bees do, and now these branches are just hanging heavy with these clusters of almonds. And to see those almonds developing, they're about that big right now, and just fuzzy green color, just real thick, and it was just fascinating to see. I enjoyed it. So work during the day and then work during the night, right? That's a vacation. So we loaded up a few semis. One was headed to like Louisiana or something like that, I think, and the other one was going to Florida. And then I think the day we left, sent one to Perry, Iowa. They just rolling them out. I think they did around 40 loads. 2 guys, that Tyler Holton from Elkhart, Iowa, and another guy out there, Ethan Rasmussen, are working together. And those 2 know how to work. It's very impressive, because usually they're on their own, you know. But this week they had 2 extra guys standing around to at least help with nets and smoke the bees and that kind of stuff. But man, they work hard. So basically, as the sun goes down, it's the opposite of what we think of as a beekeeper's sort of life. I hate working night bees. You know, I end up doing that too much with my job. I go and work other people's bees during the daytime, and then my own hives I'm working in the evenings. In drizzly weather where an inspection gets canceled, oh boy, now I have an opportunity to work my own bees, or weekends, that kind of stuff. And you know, but normally I try to avoid working after dark as much as possible in the bee yard, and yet that's basically what these guys are doing, you know, is can't really move bees around when it's warm and sunny. So as soon as that sun goes down is when they're just getting to work, and then they'll go until 2, 3, 4 in the morning, almost every night. 7 days a week they're working to get these loads out. So it was just really impressive to me to see how much goes into handling these bees. And another thing I appreciated was the care that they're taking in handling those. I know that going out to California is rough on bees. You know, there's stresses involved in it, and you just assume that whoever's handling these bees isn't necessarily going to be as gentle on those boxes as you would if you were the one driving that lift, that kind of a thing. But I didn't really see that, and I appreciated that. It's kind of good to see the other side of the coin for a few days, and then also good to come home afterwards. I think I was stung about 300 times the day we loaded this truck up. It was a wild ride, just all day. This was a nice piece of it too. Got a little blood orange action pulled right off of a tree. That is just in my head, and you know, I'm an inexperienced kind of guy. That's about as exotic as it gets, right? The idea that you could just be walking by a tree and pull a piece of fruit off of it, and it's as advertised, just really, really juicy, sweet kind of stuff. I mean, I don't even know if I ever had a blood orange before. So there it was in a F-650 riding around eating blood oranges. All right. Here's Koehnen's. So if you ever start a hive of bees with a package, there's probably a pretty decent chance that you've had Koehnen bees. The scale of this operation is just amazing, right? And it's another one of those things I've known about. I started keeping bees, of course, in Kentucky. And there we get most of our bees from Georgia and that kind of thing, mostly coming from the East Coast. But after moving out here to Iowa, it just seems like Koehnen's, a couple other options, right? Oliveras, that kind of thing. There's a few, right? But to see the scale of operation there was amazing. Now, this huge piece of equipment is because, maybe this is interesting to you, maybe not. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's fascinating to me. As huge as they are in the bee world, and you think the percentage of bees that get started across this part of the country that come from this business is just, it may be insane, but also amazing. And then you get there and you realize, oh, this is just a tiny piece of what they do. They are very proud to keep their workers busy around the year because they've got this, and then almonds and walnuts, and they are in the thick of it. And so a lot of that machinery is like nut handling equipment that I personally can't even guess what all that stuff does. But underneath that, you see all these hives. And on first, look at that picture, you might think, well, that doesn't seem like very many hives to shake all these packages. But no, those are just their cell builder hives. Those are full of cell bars of queens. That's how many queens they're pumping out of there. So I don't know, maybe Pat might even know how many queens that they've got going. I would guess around 90 at least in each one of those hives.
Usually 90, 96 on a cell bar, and they're probably running 2 to 3 cell bars per hive.
So think about that, how the turnover of just the number of cells in each one of those boxes that just started and then goes into an incubator and just crank it and crank it and crank it and crank it. And so each one of these hives, that is what it does. And I assume after a certain point, you probably gotta churn these hives over and replace older stock with younger and keep things cranking. But just the notion of somebody just sitting there and grafting 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 for hours on end, a few people, I'm sure, to keep those things full is just, well, hopefully fascinating to anybody that's a beekeeper, certainly to me.
Andy, during the shipments back and forth, do they block the bees in or screen them in or anything? Or they just count on loading them up at night and the bee's going to stay there?
Are you talking on our hives on semi-trucks or the packages? Yeah, so they're screened in. Now, as they're being moved, they're not. And often they're not even strapped down to the trucks, which is amazing because their roads are bad out there. Where we have dirt roads that can be graded, they've got paved roads that they just patch, and it's crazy bad sandy soil, and it just slumps in, and then you're just jarred. So it's like the miserable conditions for moving bees. But those pallets just go on these trucks, and then they go down the road. And there was hardly a strap thrown over these trucks. Straight trucks, like 20-foot straight trucks, is what these guys are running. Not Koehnen's, but when we were moving bees.
But again,
pulling them out of the almond
the entrances
orchards,
are
clustering them
screened
in.
at that
No,
point?
wide
Yeah.
open entrances. So we're at night, and the temperatures were fairly mild, and with the extra guys we were smoking, I'm not sure how much of that they even do when it's just a couple of them running. So it's just basically throw them on those trucks and scoot is the idea, and get them where they're going to be. And again, it's just fascinating that you can kind of do these things and get away from it. You just think that people will be all over you, especially in a place like California. I don't know, they must kind of turn a blind eye in some of these heavily agricultured areas because it's not the California I think of when I think of California. But I mean, just throw that loader on a trailer and they have them kind of tilt, you drive it on and the forks kind of get locked in, and there might not be a chain or anything on there, and right down the road to the next one. It's ranching, heavy ranching. It's amazing. So no screens, those entrances are wide open. There's no nets over these things until they're loaded up on semis. And then on that semi, like that last picture I showed back here, of course that's a net that's over the top of the whole thing. But inside there's wide open. And so the idea is just get them going down the road, and temperatures are pretty mild. A lot of we ran into snow on the way back for a little while there, going through Wyoming into western Nebraska. It was snowing on us. So you're up high enough in elevation that at least they're in cluster, and it works. Now you pull the nets off, and I've seen loads coming back in previous years, just, you know, being the inspector, whatever, happen to be places when loads are getting netted. And sometimes there's quite a few dead bees lying on there. The load we got in this morning actually was in pretty good shape. You know, there's a few dead bees that have been flying, couldn't get back home, whatever, got caught on that net or whatever, and you see those kind of along the way, but they're in good shape. So, I mean, it works. It definitely works. So, yeah, that's a good question. The things as a hobbyist that you worry about, I mean, there was a time I would have fretted and everything over, you know, having every little corner all nice and tight and screen shoved in the entrance and maybe a strap around the boxes to hold everything to still on the back of, you know, my old Ford Ranger or whatever. It would get about, you know, 5 or 6 hives in the back total, that kind of a thing. And then you go out there and you see, oh, this is how it's done. That works too. It's the opposite of what I've been doing. So, but yeah, so Koehnen's just an amazing scale and super nice family too. That was the other thing. It's interesting when you go somewhere, it's over 100-year-old business, and the person that's loading up your trailer with the packages is the Koehnen that's running the show. And that was the kind of thing, and the experience that was there was just amazing. You know, you just wouldn't almost assume it, but I guess maybe you should assume it, that it should be that way. But just nice, humble, very accommodating people that took time to be nice to kind of rough looking guys that were there just in awe, or at least I was in awe. I don't know if Jason was. So this is our second one. And I put that on there to basically end the trip, because that was a bracket, you know, one was at 5 a.m. and the other one was almost back to Omaha, but those were our wheels blown out. Notice that there's no fender. That was our solution to that at 5 a.m. was to take a hive tool and pull that fender right off and throw it in the back, and then found a dumpster at Koehnen's and threw his fender in there. So we made it. So that was our trip there. I'd love to see it in bloom. That's my one, I wouldn't call it a regret, but for these last several years I've been sending bees out there. I would just absolutely love to see the bees being put into these trees and see all that white and pink bloom, and it just looks awesome from the pictures. And the pictures, I guarantee, don't do it justice. That would be cool. So I'd like to make it out there at least one more time to see that. All right, enough storytelling. So springtime 2020, so basically I wanted to start last year at about this time, coming through winter, and kind of make a parallel, because I think some of us did really well last year, and then some of us absolutely got our butts kicked last year. And it seems like coming through this winter, that is the dynamic. Over half the bees across the state that were alive in October are no longer with us. They're gone. And sadly, that's not too far off about where our average is. We've had worse years. But the thing that stands out in my mind, at least so far, this seems to be pretty glaring, is that either the beekeeper came through with fairly minimal losses, or they came through with fairly minimal live hives left over. And there isn't a whole lot of room in the middle of that bell curve. It's one extreme or the other. And that's kind of interesting, right? And so if you're trying to look at, you know, where are we and what do we do now to prevent that sort of thing from happening, or if you had the good experience, to keep it to keep it good into next year, right, to continue on, I think you almost have to reflect on that and try to think, okay, what did I do right, what did I do wrong, right? I think too many beekeepers just press repeat year after year, you know. And so kind of what I wanted to talk about tonight is just kind of what happened last year, and see, maybe this was mutually shared and maybe it wasn't. I have a feeling that there's probably a lot of people in here that had a similar experience as to the norm. So springtime last year was pretty good, right? And this year's starting off pretty well too. Compare package season coming into a couple years ago when we were getting hives back and bringing packages in and we were under snow, right? I remember a picture of Patt shared of snow all the way up on your hives, right? Was that 2 years ago? When was that?
3 years ago. That was 3 years ago.
3 years ago already, time flies. So compare that to right now. You know, I think we're okay at 50 degree, whatever, week of 50 degree temperatures. But last year it just seemed like that perfect ramp up coming out of winter, overall. Where just every day was a little better, a little longer, a little warmer than the one before. We didn't have too much rain. It was just a really nice year. There was a little cold snap through central Iowa around the 3rd week of April. I remember that. And that took out some brood maybe 2-frame splits that people have been making. You know, we did have some bee kills related to that, but that happens a lot where our weather's good, and we've had that this year, right? We had some really warm weather a week or so ago, and now we're cooler. But overall, I feel like we're almost repeating what we had last year, and I hope that's true. But in terms of management, when you have good early bee buildup, you have good early mite buildup too, right? Because your mites are reproducing varroa mites down in the bee brood. And so the sooner that your queen goes gangbusters, laying those big slabs of brood in there, more pollen you have coming in earlier in the year, the mites dive into those cells and get a head start, right? So, and coming through a winter that wasn't too extreme is part of that too, right? Because sometimes I feel like if you have a lot of mites in your hives and you have a real mild winter, you might eke through it, right? You might still have bees, but you also have those mites. But if you have a good sizable number of mites unchecked, and you have an extreme winter with lots of, you know, really cold spells, that'll take them out, right? And so when we have a couple mild winters, if you've got those midland sort of mite infestations in your hives, those can eat through and cause you trouble in spring too. So keep that in mind this year. By far, varroa mites are our biggest problem, right? I probably don't even need to say that out loud. So a lot of this is mite-centric. So we've had a lot of good opportunity for mite control in 2020, and it's looking to be about the same this year, right? We like those nice, slow ramps through spring into summer. Plenty of opportunity for treatments, plenty of opportunity for the queens to lay more brood, for that brood to emerge, hive numbers to build up, and then along comes honey flow, and we're ready for it, right? So summer of 2020 is pretty good as well, right? Generally dry and warm. I feel like I also feel like I can say this without it being some sort of humble brag or something like that, because I'm guessing that we all share this experience. The honey that I made, I'll put it personally, in 2020 is, I think, the best honey that I've ever made in my beekeeping experience. That was some damn good honey. And I'm guessing, if we go across, I'm seeing some heads nodding. If you've been at this for a few years, we always make good honey in Iowa. I feel like we make some of the best honey in the country here. Way better than the Kentucky honey. I'll say that 100%. But last year's honey was something special. And I think largely, you know, we had good bloom, we had this and that, it's nice light and color and all of that, but it's dry, right? Any of you check your moisture content? Was it below 17 often? You know, my stuff was averaging anywhere from 15.5 to about 17.5, really fluctuating in there. But so I don't know what my average was, but it was pretty low. I would almost bank on it being lower than 17% moisture if I had to average over across the whole crop. That's way lower than what it normally is. I've had years where I've kind of been like sweating out whether I needed to find a way to dry it down some. That was not the case last year, and it just shows what an amazing difference just in the quality of honey that extra percent of moisture does. It must just concentrate those sugars. You know, it's just really, really good stuff. So we had quite a year last year. But as we're making this honey, and as our weather was so good, it's all this food coming in the hives, hopefully y'all averaged pretty good average of this exceptional quality honey. Those mites are building up in there. You know, they're doing their thing too. There's always got to be a dark side. But as we went through, that season was just so good from spring through. I didn't see, as the inspector, I didn't see a lot of brood disease issues. You know, these past several years have been marked with so much European foul brood. That's a background disease that I know I've gone full years in this job without ever seeing European foul brood back in the day. And then all of a sudden it started trickling in, and in these last several years, it was just a constant. You know, I've seen it like every day through, say, the month of June into July, these last several years. And this past year was really not that case. You know, I saw it here and there, but we weren't overwhelmed with this. You know, when it's good, right? Kind of back to that mentality. When things look good, they are good. We had a lot of swarming, right? We had huge populations of bees, and if you weren't managing that and splitting it out and staying on top of your honey supering and everything we know to do with as being beekeepers, those bees thought, well, these are ideal conditions, and we had a ton of swarming. So they were, you know, go forth and reproduce and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of a wild ride of the summer. I have this picture of a generator and a coffee pot plugged in to remind me we also had derecho. And that knocked our power out in town for quite a while, and I know a lot of people had a lot worse conditions than what we did there. But as for my own bees, I'm kind of switching back and forth between given all that good opportunity that we had in springtime, I took advantage of that and I treated and checked, and I thought that my colonies were in great shape for mites, and I still think that. Going into honey flow, I treated almost all the way up until I was putting those first couple honey supers on, and then of course not treating through the time of the year with honey supers on. So for me, it's been treat through spring, break, and then treat again in late summer once those honey supers come off. And given the year that we had and no state fair and all that, I thought I'm ahead of the curve, right? Because state fair for me is a very busy time, and I got those honey supers off a couple weeks earlier than what I normally would. I was extracting my crop when usually I was down spending time at the state fair, working in the booth, doing all that kind of stuff. And so I thought, man, I had every opportunity to treat for these mites, get them where I want, put them in check, get that good honey crop off, get it off earlier than what I have in years. And by the time, in a couple of yards in particular, and I'm no big commercial beekeeper, I have 6 or 7 yards, a couple of these, by the time I was pulling those honey supers off, I was already seeing bad brood downstairs caused by mites. So already having hives that were not collapsing, but where you're getting that spotty pattern and maybe some deformed wing. And as you're pulling boxes apart, those seams of drones, that get laid kind of between your bottom bars of the top box and your top bars of your bottom box, you get that little seam in there, and you rip those boxes apart, and now you've got kind of exposed drone brood. Check that for mites, seeing mites in there. And it really was just in 2 of the yards where things were bad, and the other ones were okay, but not great. And it's just amazing how that played out last year, where you think as a beekeeper, been at this for a little while, I can't say I really know what to do, but I definitely know what not to do, and still you get hammered by them, right? And that put a panic in me like I haven't experienced in beekeeping for several years at least, for quite a while, was just this notion that I don't know what else to do. Because I felt like I had covered my bases, and still I was just, again, getting my butt kicked with these mites. And then as inspector, I'm seeing it happen there. But in my inspection work, if I'm going to your hives, I'm seeing a snapshot in time, right? I'm seeing them like on that Thursday, August 19th or whatever, and then I go away and I might not even see it for another year or who knows how long. I don't know necessarily what your management was earlier in the year. I don't know what it's going to be after I leave. It's just kind of a snapshot in time. Where my bees, I knew what I did, and still I was seeing this kind of stuff. So I just saw so many hives just completely falling apart last late summer, heading into fall. Again, it's becoming a repeating thing.
You still have some hives in Beaverdale?
Yes, I didn't have any in my backyard last year. I moved all of those out. I live in Beaverdale neighborhood of Des Moines. And largely I'm keeping most of my bees outside town in larger yards. And the reason is not because I have a problem with keeping bees in town, but it's hard for me to extract my crop, bringing it into town, and dealing with the robbing of my own bees. So it just becomes a literal nightmare. It's the things that wake you up is pulling in with a truck loaded in honey supers and having to get that off indoors. And here comes bees that just seem like they're waiting for you to pull in. And I don't want to have neighbor issues, and I don't want to deal with that kind of stuff. So I didn't keep any hives in my own backyard last year. Yeah. So pulling off the honey crop last year was easier than it has been in a while by getting it off a little bit earlier, and the weather was perfectly cooperating and dry, and the bees were still getting a little trickle of nectar in even at that time. Speaking of robbing, it wasn't nearly as bad last year as what I've experienced last couple of years. So that's another positive too. But again, with that just really low moisture honey there on a refractometer, just great stuff. So definitely, just like everything's complicated and complex, there isn't any easy summary. A lot of goods for 2020, and that has not been pointed out, I think, enough. We focus on everything that was messed up about 2020. There's a lot of good to say through 2020 in the beekeeping world, right? A lot of us are kind of self-isolating kind of types anyway, so that worked out okay. But man, those mites got us. Late summer and fall, heading in through this, realizing, oh man, we had a lot of mites, and people scrambling and treating, and then realizing that their treatments weren't as effective as what they wished they were. That was kind of another broken record that I heard from beekeeper after beekeeper in inspections and conversations with people is, I treated with Apiguard and it didn't work. Is there a resistance issue? Not that I know of, but just time and again, just people that were let down by treatments that we know are effective, right? And I think there was just so much brood, food still coming in, right? And it's hard to combat mites if your hives are just good. If you've got a weak hive, a queenless hive, no brood, it's easy to kill mites. There's nowhere for them to hide. But if you have a really robust hive that just has block after block after block of brood, it's tough, right? And here's this word oxalic. False hope, wishful thinking, waste of time, dead bees. I wanted to state it like that. I also think that there's a time and place for oxalic acid, and it's an awesome tool in our toolkits. But when you have that hive that has 11 frames of solid cap brood in there, and it's, August 19th, whatever date I said earlier, and you're gonna try and give that an oxalic vapor, you're gonna see mites drop, right? If you had a sticky board in there, you'd think, man, this stuff works great, because it does for what it's intended for. But all the mites that are down in that cap brood are untouched. And even the notion of coming in on a weekly interval or whatever, it just seems like that is not cutting it if you have a whole lot of brood in there. And so that was another one of those kind of things last year. If we're going to take our experience last year, good and bad, and put it through a management lens, how should we do this again? Should we press repeat or should we do something different? I think a lot of people that treated with oxalic wall hives were heavily brooded, and that's the important piece there. Might consider maybe coming in with a different treatment for that time and then using oxalic as a cleanup treatment when there's less brood in that hive, little to no brood, and then you're in great shape right now. If that's what you did last year, you probably wintered well, and you probably have very low mite numbers right now. Feeding and treating, right? This was a bicycling camp out that I went to with my son. What was the date? Was it even October? Yeah, it must have been October, early October. And we ended up getting a few inches of snow. It's crazy. So be prepared, right? I guess that's the moral of that. But then after that October cold snap, 17th or 13th or whatever that was of October, it warmed up, right? We had the Indian summer and that lasted. We could ride that for a while. But when that cold snap happened, again, I was just like, oh, because we're all hit heavily with mites, and we're trying to get that treatment in early enough to where we can get the mites killed out, but still have season left where the bees are still rearing up brood, and we want to get those cycles of that good clean brood that's being reared up with no mites around. We want to get a couple generations of that before we actually have to go into winter. And when this cold snap came, it's just like, oh, like the first thing on my mind when I crawled out of that tent wasn't even, oh my God, what am I doing? It was, because I knew I needed more time. And we did get that time largely. Surprisingly, the bees kept going, especially if you're throwing a little pollen sub in there. Those pollen sub patties, I resisted those for a long time years ago, and then I just, peer pressure, right? I see them working for other people. I started using them. I can't imagine going through an Iowa late season without spending a few bucks on those pollen. I just feel like they pay dividends because you get that continued brood, right? You're just stimulating just a little, please give me a few more days or another couple weeks of egg laying. Please just keep it going to get healthy brood in there after these mites. So I figure that's the strategy there. All right. Then winter, we made it through. Not too bad, right? About the same probably, or similar to the winter a year ago. We had our cold spells, especially towards the end, right? We had some pretty bitter cold, and then all of a sudden spring type conditions have broken through. And so here we are kind of back where I started, with about 50+% of the bees gone, taken out. And I don't think that the winter that we had is what took the bees out, right? You often hear people say things like, cold doesn't kill bees. Cold, wet bees will die, but not cold bees. Or If you're already compromised by mites, then you hit those cold snaps with those dwindling, diminished clusters, and that'll be the final thing. And I just feel like that's what happened to us. There is another piece of good news down here, is that something I've been doing more and more of through these last several years is looking at Nosema spore counts, right? That's a fungal gut parasite, Nosema. We've got 2 different species of it, at least, that are in our bees here in the United States. One we've known about for 100 years, Nosema apis, right? And so a lot of times you'll see some dysentery, you'll see some fecal spotting maybe around an upper entrance of your hive, or you'll see some on your top bars of your frames, and you think, oh, that's Nosema. And that's just not really, it doesn't seem to be the case. That correlation seems like it used to be way stronger than what it is now. And I think largely, my understanding, is that the majority of the Nosema that we have is not Nosema apis, it's Nosema cerana. And Nosema cerana has a whole different life curve through the seasons, you know, similar life cycle development of the spores, how they germinate in the gut, what they do, all that kind of stuff, but its seasonal life cycle is very different, and the effects that it has on bees are different than apis as well. The symptoms are really vague. It's, you know, dwindling hives, unproductive hives, crawling bees down in the grass on a spring morning, you know, where maybe you'd see some bees crawling on the grass collecting dew or whatever, but in dry conditions you still have bees crawling. Maybe your bees just kind of look stiff and constipated, as my son likes to say. You know, there's a variety of these conditions, and it'd be hard to pinpoint any of them. But if you cut the abdomen off of that bee and grind it up with mortar and pestle and look at it under a scope, now you can see spores, and now you know. It's not just, I saw some bee poop in the hive, so it must be Nosema. No, it's I see spores, and I know that these spores are Nosema. This past year, this past spring, this past couple months, all these dead bee samples, anytime that these conditions were like that, I would take 25 bee count, at least, maybe a couple of them, and have a look at them back in the lab under a scope. Almost all of the ones I looked at, I can think of one exception to this, which was a low count, but almost all of them were actually 0 spores. It's been a while since I've been able to say that. It just didn't seem to play, at least for the bees that I saw, did not seem to be a big factor in our losses last winter. 2 years ago, it was amazing. I never saw such high spore counts as I did 2 years ago. And it's also kind of strange how universally shared these things are. You might think, you know, here I am at a meeting, a lot of what we experience as backyard beekeepers or whatever is kind of shared around people that live near us. You know, we're in the same conditions. But it's one of the things about the inspection position that is always kind of amazing is just how shared our beekeeping experience is across beekeepers across the state. The Nosema spore counts, good, bad. Conditions of varroa mites in our hives, whether they're good or bad. Weird things that we see. Last year I saw sac brood here and there. That's another one of those things. I've gone years and years without ever seeing sac brood virus in hives. I saw it here and there last year. It's just weird how it pops up here and over here and up there. It's hard to explain why that is, but it's just amazing how universally shared this is. So in this case, this Nosema just didn't cause any issue. And in the one exception that wasn't a 0, I think that the actual number of spores that I counted on there were 4. So there's a multiplier. It makes it sound like there's way more spores in there than what there is. But the actual spores that I counted on this slide in a 25 bee sample was 4 spores. It's nothing. Absolutely nothing. Just amazing how that works. So at least we have that going for us.
What would be a high count?
Well, it's wish-washy, but what people kind of refer to is around 1 million. And I don't have a whole lot of confidence in that 1 million threshold, you know, I'm okay versus I'm not okay anymore, because that was developed a long time ago with Nosema apis. And now again, most of what we've got is a whole different species in Nosema, and I don't know if that 1 million spore threshold is even appropriate or not. But to contrast this, last year, well, 2 years ago, that high spore count year, I was seeing a lot that were in the 7 million to 11 million, some even higher than that. Spores per bee is the way that that's framed. But again, it's not that I'm counting out 11 million spores. There's a big multiplier that goes into these counts. But yeah, you know, we've been from one extreme to the absolute other extreme in 2 years' time. It's kind of an amazing thing with no real explanation. Like why? You know, I don't have an answer for that. So, kind of good and bad. All right. So here we are, just getting started, spring 21. Seeing a lot of pollen coming in up here? Maybe not quite yet, almost. It's coming in the Des Moines area and south. It seems like I've been kind of to the southern tier of counties, just nothing more than coincidence has pulled me down there a few times. And my God, is there ever a lot of pollen that's been coming in the last couple of weeks. So I figure if it hasn't been coming in heavy up here, it will be very soon. We're about done with willows, that kind of stuff down in central and southern. They're over that. And I don't know, once we get through this cooler week, it probably won't be long until we get locusts and things like that coming in. I bet we're not too far off from that. So I feel like we're off to a good start. I think I've covered all of that. And that brings us pretty much up to almost the end here. So here's some finishing thoughts here. I used this in a talk that I gave to a record-breaking crowd for me. 1%. And I felt bad in delivering a slide like this to an audience of via Zoom too, just to make it that much worse. But CCD, the worst thing to ever happen to beekeepers. And if that doesn't sound like something I would normally say, that's probably true. It's because I don't believe that colony collapse disorder is the worst thing that we have to deal with. I think that it's worse because I think a lot of these winter losses with dwindled, shrunken clusters, hives that still have honey stores, you don't see any other evidence of disease in there. You know, you're pretty confident that there isn't any other real obvious croup or crud in there. It's just cold weather, or it's just colony collapse. It's this mysterious die-off of the bees, and there isn't anything I could have done about it as a beekeeper, right? If you read news, if you Google that, that's the kind of stuff that comes up on internet searches all the time. Is just beekeeper couldn't do anything about it, just lost their bees, I guess, must have, you know, said too many cuss words or whatever. They didn't have the right karma. And I think that to be beekeepers now, it requires a little bit more input, right? Management. That's what we are. We're beekeepers, right? So we got to work at it. We got to get better at it. And this notion of colony collapse disorder took out my bees, so now I'm just going to file for a loan help and I'll press repeat the next year. I think that's kind of a bad treadmill to be on. So I guess that's largely my point through this is if we had losses last year, you got to think, what should I have done differently, and try to investigate that. Look in your combs and your dead outs. Make sure you didn't have any disease issues. Hold that comb up with sunlight coming down over your shoulder. This is easier to describe, well, it's harder to describe than it is to show. But if you're holding that frame, top bar up in your hands, lean it back, let the sun come in there and light up the bottom of those cells, right, that inner wall, and light up the top of them. And as you tip that, if you're seeing powdery kind of white crystals, not on the bottoms of the cells, but on the upper edge and towards the back of each individual cell in there, wherever that last brood was, right? We're not talking honey frames or whatever, wherever that last spotty patch, that little patch of brood was. And if you see these white flakes, perfectly brilliantly white in there, that tells you a whole lot, right? Because that's guanine. That's where the mite was defecating on the walls of that cell where that bee was pupating, right? So that mite was feeding off of that bee, harming that bee, spreading viruses through that bee, and then defecating on there. And the only evidence you've got, because that bee's no longer in that cell, but you still have that white, powdery kind of guanine in there. You can Google image search guanine varroa mites and you'll find all kinds of pictures of it. And that's a really good thing to have a look at. But if that was your case last year, you're not alone, because a lot of this is shared and we got our butts kicked. Again, I'll just say that again. These mites overwhelmed so many hives across the state. It just was a sad show. And it was despite these beekeepers' best efforts. And so all we can do is not blame it on some kind of bad juju or whatever colony collapse disorder is supposed to be, but maybe take it to heart and try to work past it. And so for me, I'll say, you know, I'm going to try harder this year. I think that might mean adding a treatment. And so, you know, I will treat again through springtime. I will get those treatments in there. Hopefully we'll have a good spring, plenty of opportunity to do that. And then as those honey supers are going on, it's my intention to throw Formic Pro in there. And Formic Pro is a formic acid based treatment. Surprise, it has the word formic right in it. And it is labeled as being safe for use with honey supers on. I don't make anything off of Formic Pro. Mighty Way Quick Strip's basically the same thing. And as long as the temperature isn't too warm, it should be relatively safe to throw into a hive that, say, early May, a month from now, basically, 3-4 weeks from now. And I'm hoping that throwing that Formic Pro in between those brood boxes, as I'm putting that honey super on, is just going to extend that treatment interval just a little bit longer into the summer season. I'm going to try to get that honey off a little bit on the early side once again, and just see where we stand. But these mites are just really getting us, and I think that's the biggest room for improvement that there are across beekeepers. Everybody knows that varroa mites are getting us. Everybody knows, hopefully, you got to treat, and how things have changed. But we're in kind of a rock and a hard place when you're trying to also make a healthy, safe for human consumption honey crop. And I think that might be my strategy this year, is to throw yet another treatment in there and see what I can do. So always be improving. We can eliminate starvation. That's our feeding, spring and fall, if they need it, and they seem to need it this year. Encourage a strong buildup, and so there's your pollen sub and your nutrition. Make sure if our weather does tuck down like it kind of is this week in the cool, and we're not getting as much flight, if you've got a lot of brood in there, that's a lot of mouths to feed. So we can come in and give them some pollen sub, right? We can give them a little thin syrup. We can eke them through this so that they don't feel that crunch, go into, I was going to say starvation mode, that's a little bit more extreme, but in kind of a dearth sort of scenario. We don't want them to reduce their brood amount. We don't want them to stretch those brood without perfect nutrition. So we can supplement that as beekeeping. We can aggressively kill our mites. We can work to prevent swarming. Again, there was so much swarming last year, and to me as a greedy person, that's a sad thing. There goes your honey crop. There goes your honey crop. These queens that we're paying 25, 27, well, how much is a queen these days? If you're buying single ones, 35, 40 bucks? I've seen them that high. That's a lot of money just to watch that thing go fly away. So we can do that. Keep things young and clean, right? That's culling out older combs. That's getting rid of any kind of, with all these mite treatments, buildup of chemicals that we're using in our hives, or disease spores, Nosema spores, all this kind of stuff in there. If we're cycling out our older, darker combs on a regular basis, then we're keeping things kind of in this eternal youth sort of stage. Years ago at the Honey Producer Conference, we had Mendez come up from Florida and talk. And that was one of the better talks. Peggy's shaking her head. He, I thought, just nailed it when he was talking about how he runs his bees so hard for pollination, which is hard on him because you're just exposed to all these ag chemicals, everywhere he goes, right? Run him out across from Florida out to California and back, and then on up the East Coast for all these different berries and different things. And his solution to that was just get rid of those old combs, right? Sell them off, let somebody else get a couple years out of them, and hopefully they'll call them out too. I feel like that's a really critical piece. Some of you are doing that beautifully, way better than what I'm doing. In other people, some places I go and I see the greasiest old dark black, thick-walled combs that you can just imagine. Combs that are older than me, guaranteed. And so we've got the whole spectrum. That's old. All right, what else do we have here? I can't read anymore. Put my specs on. Inspect them to ensure health, right? That could be me, but that could also be you, right? We need to learn what we're looking at. Keep on top of your honey flow, right? Got to keep those supers stacked high. Years like last year, just add that other box, cross your fingers just right, and go back to it, it's full. Add 2 at a time. Cross your fingers just right, go back to them. Holy crap, they're full. Like that's a wonderful experience to have. Got to stay on top of it, right? And that's for a couple reasons. 1, we don't want to swarm. And 2, sometimes if we aren't putting honey supers on readily enough, we get later in the season, and what we've done is we've plugged out the brood nest. This can also happen if you take off your crop too early, right? It's always kind of a roll of the dice to know exactly when you need to pull those boxes off. If we've got a plugged out brood nest, we don't have a whole lot of room for that queen to lay, and if you've had a lot of mites and things like this, what you want is lots and lots of brood that's clean, generations of this, so that we go into winter with a good force of bees that are reared up following those mite treatments. If we have plugged out brood boxes, the amounts of brood that is in those hives is diminished. So, I feel like that's an important thing as well. So timely honey crop removal related to that. Winter prep we've talked about, right? Feeding and treatments and culling older combs, equalizing your hives, getting rid of anything that's dink, figuring out what's wrong. Why isn't this hive thrive while the one next to it has made 5 supers of honey and this thing never really even filled up its first super? Was it because of the swarm, or is there a brood health thing, or what's going on in there? Is it just a bad queen that needs pinched and forgotten about? That kind of stuff. And then winter checks and emergency feeding too. That's something that's changed a lot, I feel like, in the last 10 years or so. Is like the notion of you gotta just get them where they need to be in the fall, and then you kiss them goodnight or whatever, and then you see them in springtime. I don't know very many beekeepers that are doing that anymore, and I think that's a wonderful thing, right? We get in there, knock on that hive and listen. I know some people have fancy infrared cameras and all kinds of things, or they shoot them with those temperature probe. I don't know how that thing works. Magic, right? Those heat sensor guns where you don't have to contact anything. See if there's a cluster, right? Can you detect a little bit of warmth in there? People paying attention to their bees in winter, I think, is a wonderful, wonderful thing, right? Every opportunity you can, get out there, keep them from starving, keep them healthy, deal with them in that way, make sure they're heavy. And that kind of brings us up to now. And it seems like if you do all of these things, in theory, you're going to have better success than someone who's not. And I don't even know if it always plays out that way. And that's the final sentence of that, is we do everything we can and then we just take our lumps and try again next year, right? So good luck with everything. I think that's my last slide. Maybe, yeah, a phone number and an email. And I'm glad it shows up. Sometimes I've used a color and it almost shows up as white on white. It's like, didn't do that on purpose. Please don't hesitate to call me. You can text this number as well. And of course, that's my email. I'm on the road about every day, which again, I enjoy. So sometimes I'm pretty slow in getting back to you. It's always just kind of a constant apology, a state of apology I live in. And that's just the way that it goes, unfortunately, right now, until we get some more help. So don't hesitate to give us a call, ask a question, text me a picture if you're seeing something funky. You know, if you want us to come on up, always glad to. So, any questions about any of that?
Yeah, we got a good amount of time for questions. So
Okay.
Andy, you got any more inspectors you got on board yet?
We still have Arvin Fell. He's been around for a while. He's out of Kelly, Iowa, so just on the other side of Ames area. And for those hand-holding kind of inspections I was talking about, you know, we have so many new beekeepers in central Iowa that just want somebody, not necessarily anything wrong, just want somebody else's eyes in their hive. Am I doing anything stupid kind of mentality, right? And he's really good at those. And every year I just wonder, is Arvin coming back? He's like the Energizer Bunny. He just has taken so many licks in the last several years, from flipping his car to some health issues to you name it, and he just keeps coming back for more. So I definitely appreciate that. And he'll be back with us this year. And I'm really optimistic on hiring a couple inspectors too. And this is where you just get into state government. I don't know why it's this time of year and I still don't have approval for something that I'm still pretty confident I'm going to have approval for, but I haven't got the green light to just hire a couple people. So with the inspector positions, sometimes the issue is I can't find anybody that is both interested and available, right? I think a lot of people would enjoy the job as an inspector until they find out, oh, it doesn't pay that great, and you have to use your own vehicle, and there's no benefits and no insurance and all this, and all of a sudden it's like, maybe after I retire, that kind of a thing, because it's not a feed your family kind of job to be a seasonal apiary inspector. I think it's fun, I think it's rewarding, but it's not going to pay very many people's bills. You have to live pretty simply. But we do have a couple guys this year that have showed interest. I think they'd be really good at it, and I'm just still waiting on accounting to just say, hire them, bring them on. I think it's going to happen, but I can't say that with 100% certainty. They should already be hired is the reality, and they're not. Yeah. So we'll see. I hope so. Any other questions?
Yeah, I had a question about pollen patties and substitutes. Like, could you explain those a little bit more? Because it's I don't know. I just every year I have a hard time like adopting that strategy, because I always feel like I want my bees to be just more adapted to this area. But
Yeah.
when should you do it? Why should you do it?
Yeah, I am on just kind of a seasonal rotation, spring and late summer and fall. And I just feel like the more you can cram into them, the better off they are. And that is a transformation. I have not always felt that way. I've been feeding them for several years, I guess. Time flies, probably 6 or 8 years at least now. But up until then, like you, I just thought ahead is like the bees, in theory, know when to build up in spring and when to shut down in fall. And, you know, you're really interfering with their own cycle, you know, of what they know to do. You're really throwing a wrench in their gears by doing this. I think the counter to that is we just don't live in a natural landscape. And we're using bees that have been raised and bred for a variety of traits, none of which have anything to do with buildup and shut down and that kind of stuff, right? We just want bees that have lots of bees in their hives, and we want bees that are gentle to work with and productive and that kind of stuff. But I really wonder how you could have a bee that's bred to respond to Iowa type conditions when they're bred in California and Georgia and Florida and whatever else, you know. I just don't know that it works that way. So I've kind of swung that pendulum from not wanting to interfere with, you know, what seems to be quote natural, to seeing the damage that mites and viruses, right? I'm talking mites, but really I'm talking mites and viruses together are doing to our bees. And you know, just you start to kind of feel like the only solution to that is to get the solution to pollution is dilution, right? That's an environmental science kind of thing that just goes back years and years. So, you know, it's calling out the older combs, right? It's getting rid of anything that's contaminated, right? And in the mite world, it's getting rid of the mites. It's killing them off, getting them out of your hives. But you still have those viruses in your bees sky high, just because the day that you come through and you treat and you drop those mites, your bees are just as sick and infected as what they ever were, right? They're at the peak of that. Just because the mites are gone, you still have the sick bees, your colony's still going to go downhill. But if you can come in with some little magical little pill that makes the queen keep laying and rearing up a couple more generations of brood before winter comes, it seems like that's the thing to do, right? Because with every progressive generation, you're healthier, and you're healthier because mites are more generations past. It's like, oh, my great-grandma was pretty sick, but I'm feeling fine. And that's the bees that I want.
Yep.
So to me, that's where I'm at. And so it seems like pollen's up, price just keeps going up higher and higher. But those patties, give them a pound of it between brood boxes, right? That's another piece of this that maybe you already know, maybe you don't, but they sure do eat it a lot faster and deal with that patty being in there if it's between the two boxes, assuming that you're in two deeps rather than on top of the upper one, right? You put it down there where your bees and brood are, they eat it up, and then you throw a new one on. And you just, it seems like you basically are wanting to keep that going, just with that as little of a break in between them as possible. That keeps the queens laying. You're probably feeding syrup or something at the same time. That just keeps them going.
So would you say spring and fall?
Yeah, that's what I've been doing. Yep. Just more of them every year. You just see it in the bees. You know, the more, it's like any kind of agriculture, you know. If you're a corn grower, the more inputs you put into it, probably the bigger crop you're going to get out of it. And it sure seems that way. For good or for bad, it seems that way in bees too. I see Pat back here. I don't know how many rounds of pollen you feed, but I bet it's something that you've incorporated into your business model.
I buy pollen patties by the pound. And, you know, what you guys are talking about, I think it's really good that, you know, we want to do it naturally, but you look at where we live in a monoculture farming world. We got beans and corn, and there's no pollen coming in from that. And so by giving them the substitutes, you're at least giving them something that they're short of.
In your experience with which kind of bee, which type have you found that?
That's another good question, right? I think I'll answer that as I head out the door. That's like such high opinions on that. And again, talk about things that have really morphed through the years. I started on Italian bees. You know, that's what everybody used in Kentucky, was just Italians, just yellow, like Wilbanks, Rossman kind of Italian bees from Georgia and on up the East Coast. That's where everybody got their bees over there. Kind of like Koehnen and Oliveira's here, that's the majority of packages that come in. Down there it was just these brilliantly yellow Italians. And I liked them, and they're gentle, and they build up, and they wintered pretty well there. It's amazing what a different winter we have. You know, Kentucky isn't really that much further south than Iowa, but there is a massive difference in what it takes to get through winter. So I moved out here, and my losses were higher than what I was used to, for sure. And I remember talking, I don't remember the context, but I remember I had two knowledgeable people. One was John Johnson, who was a smaller beekeeper, but really passionate about it in the Ames area. Been doing it forever. He's from Spencer, I think, originally, but he was extension agent in Ames, all this. And I remember talking with him. I think Phil Ebert was there, who, you know, had maybe 450 or 500 colonies at that time. They're a lot bigger now. But at that time, they were wintering their bees here. And both of those guys were just like, get Carniolans. And that's the first Carniolans I ever worked. In Kentucky, we had a Kentucky Queen program where they were trying to breed a locally adapted queen and messing around with this and that. And somebody in that program was working with Carniolans, but I didn't have any of them personally. We were working with Russians. I knew I didn't get along with those very well, which again, talk to people. Maybe some of you have great experiences with those. But I was on Italians, I switched over to Carnies, and things just clicked. And I don't know, I was becoming locally adapted to Iowa as well. So maybe I was just getting used to the different seasons or something over this first couple of years here. But I am a big fan of Carnies. And so the reason why I hesitated was now I'm back on, I started breeding my own queens there for several years. I was just building up off of, you know, stock that was largely commercially available, Carniolan stock and swarms and whatnot, which are probably all Carnies too. And I was having pretty decent success. And then I threw a wrench into that by sending bees out to California, and just on my little small scale. And in doing that, I've just kind of slowly, reluctantly stopped making up so many late season nukes to try and overwinter nukes, and just started sending more or less everything I had. And I'm largely back onto Italians now. But see, I want that bigger hive, and I want it to be big in the middle of winter. And so, you know, when we say, I hate to really mess with the bees' instincts of like their normal seasonal fluctuation in their colony size and their build up and shutdown, that's exactly what I'm doing now, is I want them to be big. I want them to have brood as late as possible. I want them to be in good strength so that they go out there and get paid and go into the almond trees in the middle of winter. And so it seems like Italian is the way to go with that. But, you know, people disagree with that. So there's your answer, not an answer at all.
What's
But
that?
I really like the Carney bees, just real Carnies. If I was wearing them
We have Pat's opinion on that?
here. Of course.
What's that, Kurt?
Like your answer to the same question, what?
I'm an Italian guy. I mean, I'm like Andy, I want big fat bees going to California because I don't get paid for runs, I get paid for big fat bees. And I don't worry about winter here in Iowa.
All right.
I've wintered Italians before in Iowa, and you can do it. I think if I was going to keep my bees in Iowa all the time, I would probably, like Andy, go back to the Carnies because they winter better, but they do swarm well, you know, and I don't think they produce as much honey as the Italians. So, you know, I want bees to go to California, and I want a big honey crop. So that's why I look at
Thank you.
How many are the bees that they're Italian when they say here and the Carnies live here?
If you really want to have some fun with that, look at Portland, California. Okay, the queen capital of the world. It's got Koehnen, it's got Alvarez, it's got Shiraz. There's, I think there's 7 or 8 queen producers in Portland, California. And how do you look at it, you've got the Saskatchewans, you've got the Italians, you've got Carnolines coming from all these breeders. How are they kept separate? Yeah. They're not.
Yeah. Which is probably a really good point to say, is probably we're giving these bees more individual traits than what they really even deserve anymore. You know, I don't think they're as extremely different as probably what they once were. Yeah.
There's pollen patties. You have your pollen patties and you have a winter patty. You cut them off at one time to put the pollen patties on the brood.
Yeah.
Winter patties just make them fat.
Yeah, well, winter patty, as I understand it, is basically just sugar with some feeding stimulants. in it, you know, like honeybee healthy or wintergreen or something like that in there. So it's basically just calories. And with a pollen patty, you have plenty of carbs in there, right? Because they've got corn syrup and that kind of stuff in there. But you also have your proteins and, you know, in theory, complete amino acid profile for the bees and all this kind of stuff, you know, selling points, basically marketing points. But yeah, at some point in the fall, winter arrives. And at that point, when you're saying, all right, winter's here, I'm done feeding, I've got what I've got, let them go. And in terms of winter patties, hopefully you don't need them right away. Hopefully you've got at least a full box, a deep box of honey, and your bees are hopefully clustered low and they've got, you know, good 70, 80 pounds plus, maybe almost 100 pounds of honey over their heads. And that gives you plenty of time to let them ride. And at least when again, see, my bees aren't wintering here, so maybe some of you could talk about this better than me, but up until the last several years, when I was wintering here, I would let them go into winter and maybe check them Christmas, New Year would be about the first time that I might get out to them and open them up once winter had started. And I would just kind of notice, oh, my bees are up in the top box, or maybe not. Or that top box, oh, it's already getting light and it's only 7th of January or something like that. And if that was the case, that's when I would come in and feed either winter patty or a piece of newspaper down with some sugar over it, or, you know, whatever, some sort of emergency feeding strategy, you know. And I wouldn't want protein there. I wouldn't want to be feeding them pollen sub in the middle of winter. I'm not sure that if you feed that, all of a sudden your colony is going to explode with brood, but you don't want to do anything to encourage that in the middle of winter. Let them ride. And when the weather starts to break, then it's time. You know, so I never tried to push. And again, I'm not the best person to answer this question because my bees just came in at 7:20. I watched the semi-pull in this morning, and another one's coming on Sunday. And not all those bees are mine, just part of it. But, you know, as the weather's starting to break, as you're coming up on your first maple, willow kind of pollens, March, you know, beginning of March maybe, that's about the earliest I personally would probably be comfortable putting them in. Does anybody disagree with that? I'm sure some of you probably are more in tune with this than what I am anymore. But I just never really felt like early pollen was a good thing to push. Because you just never know. In Iowa, our temperatures are all over the place, and you have these weeks of cold, and it seems like the last thing you want as a colony is really pushing its boundaries and laying a bunch of brood that it has to take care of. And then you hit that cold snap, and your cluster tightens up. Now you have all this dead, chilled brood out here because the colony was going gangbusters, and that cold snap, they couldn't take care of it anymore. And that kind of stuff happens, but the last thing you want to do is encourage it to happen. So I've always been a little bit more conservative about early spring feedings of pollen patties. But once spring's here, like right now, I wouldn't hesitate at all. Be putting them on there would be my advice.
Yeah, and then if anybody else got a question too, but you're talking about like culling old combs. Do you just scrape the wax off, or do you totally throw out a frame, get a new frame?
Well, there's a big market for nukes. And so, I you know, that is the way this goes, right? That's the honesty of all honesties, I think, is I feel like the best way to cull out your older combs, I'm assuming that they're not those 50-year-old black, greasy, tarry, thick-walled combs I was mentioning before, but just a comb that's reaching the end of its usable, in theory, its life. Combs can last a long time, but a lot of people call them like the liver of the beehive, right? Because they just absorb, and you know, all of the, whether it's again disease spores or chemical contaminants or our own mite treatments that we're putting in there, it all just kind of builds up, right, over time. And that's kind of like your sink in the hive. And a lot of people will say about 5-year rotation, something like that's ideal. That's probably pretty conservative, I think. You know, you see that 3 to 5 year a lot, and that's probably a really good, solid treatment regimen. I know that you can extend that out a little bit more with and never see any ill effects. But that kind of logic gets you in trouble, you know, because there's always another year. I was joking with Pat earlier about the cost of boxes. You know, wood is insanely expensive now. So all my old ratty old boxes, guess what? They get to live another year because I'm not paying for new boxes right now. And combs are that same thing. It can be an investment. But if you have your double D, if this is it, I know there's another one over here, right here. don't even think you have to be all that scientific about it, right? If we're trying to replace our combs on, say, a 5-year cycle, and we have 20 frames of comb across 2 boxes. Now, a lot of us are running a feeder, that kind of thing, so these numbers are a little, they get wonky. But in theory, if you're culling out 2 frames per box per year, that means that no comb in there is going to reach over that 5-year mark, right? If we're on this perfect rotation. And in reality, I'm not even sure if it needs to be like that, right? Because you've got brood frames and you've got honey frames, and they see different types of use, and you certainly see the brood frames darkening much faster than the honey frames that are towards the outside of the box. And I mean, there's just nothing that's black and white in beekeeping. But the idea of, you know, if you take 2 frames out of each box per year, and you're rotating that, you're eternally young. That's the idea. And you can fudge with that a lot and still end up pretty good, I think. And so the easiest way to do that is whatever combs you have that you want to get rid of, as the season's starting to wind down, put them downstairs, right? Have you all heard this trick before? So the end of the year, you know, you've got your honey crop off and you still got some time to mess with your bees and get them to look the way you want. And so during that time, not too late, I'm not talking December, 3rd or something like that, but more like September 16th, something like that. After you get your honey off and you're messing with your bees, but it's still warm enough, you're not going to upset anything too much. Whatever combs are up here that you want to get rid of, shift them downstairs. And you're going to go into winter with whatever combs you want to cull out come spring in your bottom box. And now springtime, as we know, largely, your bees are going to have moved up in your top box, right, as they're eating honey through the winter. And if you catch them early enough in spring before they've exploded, growth back down, it's really easy to take the frames of comb out of the bottom box because your bees aren't in there, the brood's not in there, the food stores are maybe even largely gone. So it's a lot easier to pull that Band-Aid off. So you just get rid of them out of your bottom box come spring, replace them with newer combs or frames of foundation. And, we're rotating. That's another common thing I didn't even address, but probably a lot of us in here are rotating our boxes, putting the bottom and maybe even flipping it around. So now the top is the bottom comes on the top. Our frames of foundation are in there. The bees now have a good chance to move up through spring, expand out that brood nest. When the conditions are right and it's plenty warm and there's nectar in or you're feeding them, they're going to draw out those foundations. It just seems like that works pretty well. So if you're doing a couple, 3, 4 frames per year out of your 2 brood boxes, I feel like you're way ahead of the average beekeeper, and that has to be doing something good. So what do you do with them?
Yes,
You can throw them away, or you can melt them down, try to render comb. I've never had any luck with scraping them off. And every now and then I'll hear of somebody that goes through scraping them off or pressure washing them and re-waxing them. I'm sure that works, but I've just never had time to rink-a-dink around with that. And I shouldn't say rink-a-dink around because there's value in this stuff, right? I mean, that adds up fast. But for me, that's never really worked. But I think the most common thing is to get rid of them before they've really hit the end of their life, and get rid of them by selling them as nukes. And so if you get a nuke, you can probably imagine that those aren't combs across that entire nuke that were drawn out 9 months ago and haven't even reached 1 year of age yet. They're probably combs that have had at least a couple of years, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Just know it. As you buy your nuke, you're buying someone's used equipment for all goods and bads. It's a great way to start a box of bees. And then in a couple of years' time, those are probably going to be the first combs you're going to want to call out, and then it's now your trouble to deal with and not Tim's or whatever. Yeah. So that seems to be the most practical way, is instead of throwing them away, sell them to another beekeeper.
Selling at the other
And we're not talking about disease stuff. We're not talking about stuff that's had anything too rough going on. It's just, I feel like, well, that's what Mendez's thing. I was just kind of glorifying him for the talk he gave years ago that stuck in my head. That's how he's calling them out. You see Mendez all across Iowa, all across the whole country, frames with his brand on it. That man has sold, it just seems like millions of frames of comb over the years doing that. Just 3 years old, time to get rid of them, sell them to somebody else, and then it's their fault. They can keep them forever or else they can pull them out. That kind of thing.
Do you mark what year they were with each frame?
I always like seeing that, and I've never gotten that habit.
Okay.
But that is a good idea. Basically, for my own stuff, I just go the laziest way possible. Is it well drawn? Has it ever had any issues, with, dead out mouse gets in there, something like that. Anything that has a physical issues coming out. Past that, it's just how dark it is, and that they draw that comb and it's just brilliantly white, and then with every brood cycle, it just gets a little thicker and a little darker, and I just eyeball it. And I'm probably not the best to say, I know I've got combs older than 5 years, I guarantee you that. The idea is just anything that's getting towards the end goes downstairs, and if all goes well, pull that.
Yep.
So maybe some of you have good ideas on what to do with those combs. Does anybody render those out anyway? Anybody find a good way to do that? It's just not cappings wax. I mean, it's just, there's a lot of gunk in there, right? Slum, I guess would be the term.
You could sell it, can't you? Sell your wax, like something like that, that's like your grade B wax. Or
Yeah, I suppose there's more. You ever got into that, Pat? I just keep throwing these questions at you because I don't have good answers for that.
C.C. Meyer,
Yeah.
we know in South Dakota renders wax, but capping wax is valuable, comb wax is not. There's too many chemicals, you can't use it for lip balm, stuff like that, so there's really not a market for it.
Okay.
And I got 700 pounds of wax in the basement, I'm trying to find a foam for it.
Yep.
I don't want to deal with the dirty stuff because I can't sell the good stuff.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, it's tricky. I wish there was a better answer than that, but I don't have a better answer for that. It makes a good bonfire. That thing goes up.
Make the fire starters, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So we got time for one more question if anybody's got anything.
Yep.
Just an FYI, we also raise grapes, and we're seeing the same kind of thing you guys are. Obviously, we don't have mites and pesticides, but we're seeing a lot more funguses. We're having to treat more often for funguses, and we're feeling the pressure of the herbicides coming in just exactly like what you're talking
Wow.
about. So it's a change in culture.
Yeah. Something's definitely different these days.
Yes.
Just everything. Gotcha.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if is it ever gonna go the other way, or is it gonna keep going, It seems like there's always more and more chemicals.
Well, all the seed companies put all the treat the seed and treat this and treat that, so it's all out there from day one that seed hits the ground, so it's always out there.
Yeah.
And like it used to be, you just, I just spray a little insecticide later on, now it's on the seed when it hits the ground, so.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's amazing when bees do as good as they do. I mean, that's the reality, because you can get pretty, negative about this kind of stuff real quick, but it is amazing that, as we're talking about all this doom and gloom and all these mites and all of that, I guess that was kind of a point that may have got lost in what I was saying, but we had a phenomenal year in a whole lot of ways last year too, it's just, I think if it's a good year for honey production and all this kind of just a bombastic hive, well, mites are doing good too, and then, all's well that ends well is the kind of thing, but man, it takes some maintenance to keep it there, but, it's not like everything is just crashing and burning. I mean, we had a heck of a year last year, made great honey crops, almost universally across the state, and not just lots of honey, but really, really good honey. I mean, there's a lot of really positive things to say too, but woo, it seems like some of those years just really crash and burn your bees out. And last year was one of them. So we'll see where this year goes, but it's definitely not all doom and gloom. Else I don't think any of us would be here. It just requires more maintenance, more attention from beekeeping. But I think that also is kind of the fun, the joy of beekeeping is getting in there and learning what you're looking at and trying to do as good of a job as what you can, right? It's way more interesting than just setting a box out there and collecting honey in 5 months, as good as that sounds.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
Yep.
all right, well,
All
thanks.
right, well, let's give Andy a round of applause. Yeah, I always appreciate when Andy comes around and just gives us that recap of the year and find out what all's going on. And I appreciate you talking about having your information too, and that's something that I want to get better at too, is sending you a picture every now and then. Because I see some things and I'm like, I don't know, I have no idea what that is.
That might be my
What's
answer.
going on. Yeah.
Send it to me.
Yeah. Yep. So that'll be good. So yeah, I encourage you to take his information, and then we'll make sure to put that out on the club as well. So one thing, did Pat sneak out? I feel like he just ran Pat. Oh, there he is. So Pat, do you have anything on the auction?
Yeah, I have sheets here, a list of the auction. I've got 7 pallets of stuff back in the shed. If you guys want to take a look at it, I got the lights on. There's a lot of really nice stuff back there if you want to look at it. The auction is a couple weeks away, not that long. So, got any questions, give me a holler. There's still stuff that's not here that's coming in for the auction. It's not on the list. I can leave this list when we put it on this.
Yeah, so please take that if you're
Just
interested.
this here, I think the auction will be a good way to help the North Iowa Bee Club make some money to do what we do here, so.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Can people still consign items?
Yes, they can, they're gonna pay the 15% instead of the 10 because they gotta do it before the first, April, so now they're at the 15%, but they can still do it if they like, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Does anybody have any questions on the auction quick before we go off of that? All right. Well, yeah, I'm really looking forward to that, and then,
Like I said, we need to have people help out a little bit on the auction.
Yep.
Set up, help out with the food maybe a little bit, stuff like that, so anybody wants to volunteer, get hold of one of us and Pat, tell me you want to come down and help. So,
yeah, yes, thank you for that. And then we'll do some club elections, and as with our club, kind of traditionally how that's gone is usually somebody would serve as vice president for a couple of be 2 years, and then maybe go to president for 2 years, and then be past president. So I've been president. It's been for 3 years now, and then I would go to past president. So Richard has offered to run for president, is anybody else interested in running for vice president by chance? Because we'll just be, we'll be looking for somebody over the summer and stuff if not, but, so for Rich, we'll say all opposed, say aye. Aye? No? Yeah. All opposed, say no. All right, Rich, you are president for next year, 21 and 22, so. All right. And then Madison has served as our secretary, and she's offered to go again for another year. I really want to say thank you to Madison. She's done a fantastic job for recording all the meetings, doing all the stuff. She's done an excellent job staying in communication. So
well, she set up her auction last year on Zoom, so that was a lot to do too. So.
Yep. Yeah. So. Yeah, and then I wanted to mention that our club, we normally do a summer potluck, or we didn't do one last year, obviously, but this year we might do one again where we did it at Rick Liebenhagen's, and he does fireworks there. Has anybody here been to that before, where he does fireworks? Just a few of us, but it's really a cool show. And Rick has battled with cancer, and then he had to get a bladder removed and all kinds of stuff, so he's been through a lot. But he wants to do fireworks again this year, so he said if he's feeling up to it, he's gonna do it. It's awesome. You think like